Matthew 22, the parable of the wedding banquet. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servant to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fattened cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burnt their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the street, gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked, 'How did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend?' The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen.'"
Thank you, Bill, for reading that parable with life. And if you've got it in front of you, if you brought your Bible along, which is a good thing to do when you come to church, please keep it in front of you so that we can refer to that as we go along. Now, if you were to go to work tomorrow and you'd be asked by a colleague, or maybe you're asked interacting with a friend or a neighbour, what did you do on the weekend? And if you were to say, "Well, I went to church," it wouldn't surprise me if the reaction you got was sort of like, "Couldn't you find anything better or more fun to do?" Now, maybe they'd be too polite to actually say that out loud and to your face, but maybe they'd be thinking that inside. It wouldn't surprise me. For many of us, for many people that we interact with, there's this common thinking in terms of religion, in terms of church, in terms of Christianity, that it's kind of... if we think about the expected stories of what the kingdom of heaven is like, it'd be quite different to the story that Jesus tells us here. He tells us a story and he starts, the kingdom of heaven is like, but the perception today is probably more like the kingdom of heaven is like the school library, where you have to sit down and you've got to be quiet, and there's a cranky librarian there making sure that you do. Apologies if there's any librarians here. I'm sure you're the exception to the stereotype. Nonetheless, the kingdom of heaven is like the dentist. Sure, we know we have to do it, but we avoid it wherever possible. Or the kingdom of heaven is like broccoli and oatmeal. Yes, we know it's good for you, but we're really hanging out for chocolate and ice cream. That's how many think. That's what they're expecting, and the kingdom of heaven is like. Perhaps we're a bit inclined to think that way too, if we're honest with ourselves about how we approach church. If we think about what is fun, if we think about what brings us the most joy, it's something that's entertaining, and church doesn't really rank high on that list. Christianity, church is often understood by so many as kind of the antithesis of fun. It's the opposite of fun. But what image does Jesus use as he's telling us about the kingdom? He says the kingdom of heaven is like what? It's like a wedding banquet. It's like a king who put on a wedding banquet for his son. It's a feast. It's a celebration. It's joyous. It's delightful. And this image of a celebration, of a party, of a banquet is probably a bit unexpected for many. Maybe for some, that's exactly what you think. It's like, man, I'm so excited to be here. This is exactly what I think about when thinking about church. And that's great. But I think for many, maybe even for most, it's a bit unexpected. It's not where we thought he was going to go. I can suggest that even because our vision as a church. Our vision defines the picture of what we want to be, what we're aiming for. This is the kind of people we want to be, and that is to be joyfully following Jesus and sharing his love. That's our vision as Hope Church. And it's our vision because we recognize we're actually not there yet. As we've done various health surveys, we recognize it shows us that our experience of joy is not right up there. It's not where it should be. And so that's our vision, to be joyfully following Jesus. So let's explore this picture of a celebration, of joy, of feasting. It's often, we talk about the kingdom of God, we often assume we know what we're talking about when we talk about the kingdom of God. And rather than just assume that we know what we're talking about, we're just spending these 2 weeks, last week and this week, to explore some of the pictures Jesus gives us. So today we're looking at this image of the kingdom as a celebration. What's worth celebrating? If we're sort of seeing that we're a bit low on the experience of joy, why is that? What are we missing? And we want to explore that because we see in this parable that some miss the celebration. Some refuse the celebration. The kingdom of heaven, it's like a wedding banquet that a king threw for his son. And the key image is that of lavishness, is that a word? It's rich. And think of the scale. This is no mere family affair, just a little family wedding. No, this is a king. This is like a national event, a royal wedding, and there's the fattened cattle have been slaughtered. It's the best food. It's rich food. Think dollops of whipped cream and so on. And the king sends out his servants to get those who are invited, but they refuse to come. Now, the initial context in which Jesus told this parable is in the context of his ministry on earth. As he goes about and he tells the story, the king is God, the son is Jesus himself, and the first hearers are the Jewish people, who were the chosen people of God. And they didn't receive Jesus, by and large, they didn't receive Jesus very well. Not exclusively rejected him, but many of them did. And that's the first context of the parable. It's explaining that situation of Jesus comes in, God's doing something, and they've rejected it. But the application of it, the relevance of it, extends far beyond that immediate circumstance. And we're going to spend most of our time really reflecting on the broader reality that there's an invitation of the gospel. God's doing something, and thinking about people's response to that reality of what God's doing. To understand the gravity of these people's refusal to accept the invitation of the king, you want to understand the real offense. What's the real offense when we reject a wedding invitation? Think about it. A friend of yours comes you're getting married. And you go to your friend and you say, I'm getting married. Here's an invitation to my wedding. And they say, thanks, but I'm not coming. Like, what's the real offense there? Are you most upset because they're not going to be able to drink your champagne? Are you most upset because, they're going to miss out on cake? You really want to come and eat cake? No, you're upset because I thought you were my friend. Why don't you want to come and celebrate this greatest big day in my life? It's an offense to you, isn't it? They're slighting you. And that's what's going on here as they refuse the king's invitation. It's an affront to him and to his son. That's the real problem. Now, as we see here, there's these descriptions in the king's response, there's descriptions of pretty severe, even violent reaction to what these people who have been invited have done. And that doesn't sit very well with us, does it? It doesn't sit very well with our cultural sensitivities or sensibilities about what's right. We sort of think, hang on, what kind of king is this? I don't really like the sound of that. We'll get to the issue, if we've got time, we'll get the issue of that sort of severe judgment a bit later. But I want us to see that the king, who represents God, is not simply short-tempered. He's not simply sort of reacting flying off the handle. You see, verse 4 issues another invitation. Sends more servants out. Go and get those people who I've invited. He didn't just flip out at one rejection. He's gracious. He's patient. I'm going to issue the invitation again. I'm going to give you another chance. Of course, the second invitation is ignored as well. verse 5. Or verse 6, we see it's actually even actively opposed with violence. The king and his son are rejected because people want to go off to their field, want to go off to their business. These other things are desired more. And that's so prevalent, isn't it? So many people around chasing after their work, chasing after that next car, chasing after the bigger house, not at all interested in God, don't even really care who he is. And that's the fundamental human condition, which we're all still prone to in some way. We wrestle with that. Think how often our choices are defined more in terms of our preference for family, our preference to focus on the mortgage, our preference to pursue sport rather than serving God, rather than pursuing his kingdom. God doesn't seem good enough. Other things are going to make us happier. We'll chase that right now. And to recognize why that's problematic, I mean, just think about how your priorities are shaped and how people expect your priorities to be shaped around the idea, my little sister is getting married on such and such a day. Like what happens? On Saturday, whatever, my little sister is getting married. Like, if you're having a work discussion, oh, can you come into work that day? No way. My little sister is getting married that day. And they'd expect, yeah, well, that's a big day. You better be there. I'm not going to be at the beach on that day because my little sister's getting married. I'm not going to be cleaning the house that day because my little sister's getting married. And if you were at the beach or you were cleaning the house and someone saw you, they're like, what are you doing? Isn't your sister getting married today? Like, there'd be something wrong. And yet how often do we kind of have it completely the other way around when it comes to God? We say, oh, I just don't have time to invest more in God. I don't have time to read his word more. It just doesn't work. I don't have time. Hang on. Isn't your little sister getting married? Like, just doesn't quite add up if it's really that significant. What it would look like if we had that same priority, there's this big event going on, this is what's really important to me, is that when there's the family event, you say, yes, family, I'm grateful that you've thrown this lunch for me, but you know what? I'm going to be gone at 4:30 because I really want to get to prayer meeting because I want to be with the King, and that's important. When we get offered to do overtime at work, and you think, yeah, I could make more money, I'm going to pursue into this overtime, but no, actually I'm going to say no to this overtime because I've already lined up, I'm going to be reading the Bible one-to-one with a friend of mine, and so I don't want to do the overtime. We rather than just investing ourselves in trying to please our boss so that we'll get ahead and go in the extra mile because then I'll get the pay rise, then I'll get the promotion, then I'll get the bonus. No, I'm going to take time out. I'm going to pursue hospitality. I'm going to build relationships through inviting people into my home because I love the King and I want to be doing what he wants me to do. When our friends invite us to something on Sunday morning or maybe Saturday night that's going to make us tanked for Sunday morning, they'll get used to the fact that we're going to say, you know what, that sounds like fun, but I want to be with the King. And it doesn't help if I'm not there. Like, it'll become the priority. My little sister's getting married. People expect us to respond that way because this is a big deal. How often does our thinking actually show that we've kind of got the other way around? The second invitation, as I said, is gracious, that the King doesn't just snap at the first time. But when this second invitation is rejected, we see that the King responds with even more grace and with even more surprising generosity. He doesn't just sort of say to someone, well, it looks like it's just going to be you and me and the family. That's all we've got to celebrate this occasion. No, he throws the invitation wide. He says there will be a celebration. We are going to have people at this wedding. This is a day that deserves celebration. My son is worthy of this celebration. So he throws the invitation wide. He invites everyone in. And perhaps the biggest surprise, which also contains in it the greatest hope, is found now in who is invited. In verse 10, the servants went out into the streets. They gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good. That's a bit unexpected, isn't it? The bad as well as the good get invited to come in to this celebration. This invitation doesn't depend upon being bad or being good, because Jesus deals with what is bad. That's the nature of the kingdom. That Jesus, as he goes to the cross, bearing the penalty for what is bad, he says, I will take that penalty for those who trust in me, so that they can come in, they can celebrate the banquet, they can be part of the kingdom, because I've taken that and they don't have to. That's the good news of the kingdom. That's what makes it such a great celebration. The bad as well as the good. And what sort of attitude, what sort of atmosphere would we expect to be present in that banquet hall amongst all those people who have been gathered in? There's a bit of an interest in royal weddings, isn't there? In 2018, Prince Harry got taken off the market. He got married to Meghan Markle. 2011, Prince William, that so many had their hopes on, well, he got taken off the market, marrying Kate. I remember years ago, this was before I even went to school, when Prince Charles and Lady Diana got married. You know, and all these weddings, they're televised publicly. And I remember some people actually coming around to our house to sit around our little television in the dining room. I think it's this vague memory because it was before I even went to school. But, you know, they sat there and they watched the royal wedding. I didn't quite get the thing. Like, I didn't watch any of the weddings. But hey, if I got invited to one of these weddings, I'd go. Like, I reckon it'd be a good experience, and it'd be something you could say, like, I got invited to such and such a wedding. I was there, and you should have seen the food, and you should have seen, like, it'd be good, wouldn't it? Even though I'm not particularly keen to watch it on TV. You know, there's this interest, but we've got no hope of being invited. I never received an invitation to any of those 3 weddings. Miffed. You know, like, we don't expect to, do we? It's only special people get invited to that wedding. And I'm not one of those special people. But that's not how this king operates. He throws the gates open. Everyone can come in. And the people who didn't expect to be invited were invited to come and participate in it. What sort of atmosphere would be there? It would be like gratefulness, wouldn't it? It'd be like, isn't this awesome? Isn't it a great privilege that we've got to be involved? And that would shape the way they responded to each other too, wouldn't it? All just aware of how lucky they were to be there, how privileged they were to share in this event. Shouldn't that be what church community is like? We're all just so privileged to be just aware that, man, I don't deserve to be here. I don't deserve to have a relationship with Jesus. So rather than being selfish and responding to each other and trying to get one up and whatever, shouldn't there be this wonderful attitude of gratefulness and gratitude? Fortunately, it's not always what we see, is it? Too often we talk about grace so much, but we're not really acting like it's real. And when we recognize that, we ought to go and seek that grace. Lord, my life is not adding up with what you've given me. Help me to be more grateful. Help me to understand this grace that you've poured out to me, because I clearly need that. Why is the kingdom of God like a banquet, like delightful, joyful? It's not just because it's some wild free time with all the restraints thrown off. That's what we think of fun, good time, isn't it? When no one's stopping you from doing what you really want to do. That's not why this is good. It's good because of the kind of king that is throwing the banquet. The kind of king that God is. He's gracious. He's generous. He's willing to sacrifice himself for other people, for his people. He seeks our good. He's willing to endure death so that he might grant other people life. That's why it's a good king. The kingdom, that's why it's delightful. And think about the other things that we pursue looking for happiness. Think about how many of them are driven by people's desire for money. Think about how many of them are driven by this kind of culture of selfishness going on. That doesn't actually result in our ultimate good and happiness. That's not what this king is like. But, probably waiting for us to get to some of the questions here, of course, this attitude, this atmosphere of gratitude, it's interrupted. Verse 11 and 12, as the king comes in, he finds someone there who is not dressed for the wedding. What are we to make of that? Maybe as you read it, you're sort of thinking, boy, this king's a bit particular, a bit finicky. He seems a bit perhaps unfair, maybe a bit uncaring. Perhaps this guy couldn't afford any better, and now he's just sort of been heavy-handed. Well, the point is not that this man can't do any better or that the king is uncaring. The point is that the man responds to the invitation, but he responds and attends on his own terms. I'll come as I want, not necessarily as you want. I mean, you think about when you go to a wedding. You get invited along to a wedding. We've got a socially sort of acceptable standard as to what you do to go to a wedding. You dress up. You don't just turn up in your work clothes that are all dirty from being on site or whatever. Like, you're going to put in an effort. Why are we going to put in? I mean, some people go to a huge effort. You know, you got that dress that you only wore once for last wedding, but maybe there'll be some people here who saw you in that dress. You can't wear it again. You have to go and get a new dress to wear to the new wedding. And even if you're not kind of going to go that level, you know, we're going to get dressed up. We could even borrow something. If we're worried about offending or not acknowledging the event, we might borrow some clothes. To say, look, I've got to go to a wedding and I haven't got anything to wear. To do otherwise is to offend the host, isn't it? Is to offend the special couple because I couldn't even be bothered getting dressed up. See, it's not just that this guy couldn't do any better, he's in a hard spot. Because how do we know that? Because when the king challenges him, he is speechless. It reminds me, there's an account of Jesus going along on a journey with his disciples and they're having a discussion. He gets to the end of the day, he says, what were you talking about on the road on the way? And they're speechless. Got nothing to say. Because what have they been talking about? What have they been talking about? Who's the greatest among them all? They're all trying to get one up on each other and they're embarrassed. He caught us out. So they're speechless, all right? This guy's been caught out. The warning is, the challenge is the warning against responding to the invitation to this kingdom on our own terms. And so, you know, we might say, well, I don't need to rely totally on Jesus. I'm actually not that bad a bloke. I've done pretty well. I can fix myself up. Maybe I need Jesus for a little bit of it, but not totally. You know, we're going to respond on our own terms and come dressed as we want to come dressed. Maybe we're inclined to respond and say, look, I'll follow Jesus. That's good, but, you know, there's a few things he says about my life that I don't really like. I don't like the fact that he says this. I don't like the fact that he expects that. So I won't take those bits. I'll just have the bits that I'm okay with. We respond on our own terms. Maybe as we've been going through this and talk about the idea of enjoying church, delighting in it as a banquet, maybe you're inclined to think, well, actually, I do enjoy church. I really like it, but maybe it's possible that you like it because it is just the way you like it to be. Maybe there's a bit of a challenge there. What if church wasn't that? Maybe if we had to actually change the way church was so as to serve him faithfully and to pursue his mission, then maybe it wouldn't be so good. We wouldn't enjoy church so much because it's not really about following him. It's about having church the way we like it. We're so inclined to respond to the invitation on our own terms, and Jesus is giving a strong warning. Don't do that. We mustn't presume on the invitation. We mustn't presume on the grace of sort of being in that privileged position of God's people. And that's why the punchline, verse 14, many are invited, but few are chosen. And this is not, as it sometimes seems to be read or interpreted, as a justification for churches being small and staying small. Because, well, hey, after all, few are chosen. So it doesn't really matter if we're small because that's what we should expect. No, that's to take it out of context. Because look at verse 10. They gathered all the people they could find so that the wedding hall was filled with guests. This is not a justification for being small and staying small. It's a warning against presuming upon the invitation. To be accepting gratefully this invitation, to be accepting it on his terms, to be accepting it by his enabling. But what happens, we think about what happens to the man who's in the wrong clothes and gets thrown out. So as we think about what happened to the earlier people who rejected the invitation, here's that bit that sits a bit uncomfortably, doesn't it? It's an aspect of this sort of severe judgment of verse 7 and verse 13, and quite possibly bothers you. It doesn't seem to fit with the idea of the good king that I've been talking about. Sounds harsh. It sounds violent, doesn't it? and we don't like violence. And it even ultimately applies the idea of hell. And hell is sort of the one key aspect of Christianity that so many wrestle with. I wrestle with is if there's one thing that people could say, we wish we could change one part of Christianity, kind of that rates right up there on the list. It's difficult. You see, trying to understand this, judgment seems particularly undesirable to those who prize individual freedom to live any way we like. And that's the spirit of our age, isn't it? I want the individual freedom to live how I want. And so the idea of a judge, that particularly rubs against that. But you see, it seems undesirable for those who actually have the luxury to be able to pretty much live unhindered and choose the path they want. So we can sit around in a cafe and we can drink a latte and we can pontificate about whether God should judge or whether he shouldn't, because we've got the luxury to actually do that. But put yourself instead in the context of the many people around the world, particularly in the third world and the developing world or the undeveloped world, where they live under oppression, where they live under extreme abuse and violence and war and corruption. Think of people who are in economic bondage, working for a pittance, slaving away, trying to work off a debt they've got no hope of working off. Think of people who have had a marauding band march into their village and murder people and rape people in their family and their village. Put yourself in that shoe, and then how do you feel about a God that does not judge? A God that stands by and says, no, I dare not judge because that would be bad. No, people in that situation, they want a God who judges, don't they? God, put it right. And to think of a God who doesn't put it right, that's not a God worth following at all. That God won't judge and put things right is not good. Plus, how can this wedding, how can this banquet, how can this kingdom ultimately be good and delightful and joyous and pleasurable unless everything that corrupts that and everything that takes away from that is got rid of? It needs to be that way, as hard as it is to grapple with. And so, in the end, the kingdom of heaven can be this rich, this lavish, this joyous banquet with this surprising makeup of guests dragged in from everywhere. These guests that are grateful to be there, celebrating with the king and with his son, and where there's nothing to detract from or corrupt that good event, that good experience. Do you want to be there? Is the king special to you? Is his son, Jesus, special to you? Such that this just seems like the best opportunity ever.